Boy, that thing's dead. Drag it out back with the rest of the junk. Cordell Tarver was 14 years old, and he did not move. It was a Tuesday morning in March of 1987, and he was standing at the edge of his father's equipment shed in Willcox County, Alabama, watching a perfectly good day's work die before it ever started. The welder in front of him, his father's Lincoln 225, a machine that had held the Tarver place together for 11 years, had quit somewhere between the switch and the transformer. And flipping it on one more time was not going to change that. He had $40 in his pocket. He had a corn planter with a cracked hitch that had to be in the ground before the rain came, and he had exactly zero experience inside a welding machine. His father was in town at the parts store. The work was not going to wait. Somebody had already decided that machine was finished. Nobody had asked the boy. If you have ever been told that something you could see plain as day was not worth doing, stay with this one all the way to the end. And if you are new here, go ahead and hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it's the only reason stories like this one keep getting told. Before any of the rest of it makes sense, you have to understand the place. Willcox County sits in the lower middle of Alabama, in the Black Belt, which got its name from the dirt long before it got its name from anything else. Dark, heavy soil that grew cotton for 150 years and then grew soybeans and cattle and pine when the cotton money went somewhere else and did not come back. By 1987, it was one of the poorest counties in the United States, and everybody who lived there knew it, and nobody who lived there said it out loud very often, because saying it out loud does not fix offense. Camden was the county seat, 2,000 people, give or take, a grain elevator, a parts store, a diner that ran the same breakfast plate 7 days a week and would have been offended if you asked for something else, and a counter, a long wooden counter at the front of the parts store where men gathered on Saturday mornings to talk about fertilizer prices and diesel and whatever piece of equipment had died on somebody since the last time they stood there. The farms in Willcox County were not big, not by Midwest standards. They were the kind of operations that ran on repair instead of replacement, because replacement was a thing that happened to other people in other counties. The Tarver family had held the same 160 acres since 1921. That is a sentence, and it is a short one, and in that part of Alabama in that year it carried more weight than a paragraph. Alton Tarver farmed it, and when the farming did not cover the year, he fixed other men's machines for cash. Hydraulics, hitches, cracked frames, bent implements, the way his father had, and his father's father before him. He worked methodically. He did not complain, and he held a deep and permanent suspicion of anything that cost more than it was worth. He did not throw things away. That last part matters more than anything else in this story, so hold on to it. Let me tell you about the lean-to. Purvis Tarver, Cordell's grandfather, built it behind the main barn in 1938 out of salvaged tin and heart pine, and then he spent the next 40 years filling it. Every busted tool, every cracked implement, every seized motor, every bent frame, every gearbox that had ground itself to powder. Purvis had come up through the Depression in a county where a man who could not fix a thing did not eat, and he had come out the other side of it with a single, unshakable principle that he passed to Alton, and Alton passed to Cordell, in almost exactly the same words. Junk is a thing you can't fix. Purvis would let that sentence sit in the air until it had some weight on it. Everything else is just a thing you ain't fixed yet. By 1987, the lean-to had grown into something roughly the size of a two-car garage, stacked floor to ceiling, and Cordell Tarver had spent most of his childhood inside it. He knew that shed the way other boys knew baseball cards. He knew which shelf held the stator out of a 1962 generator that had thrown itself apart the year his father graduated high school. He knew where Purvis had stored the drive chain off a corn picker that had not turned since Eisenhower. He knew the smell of the place, old grease, iron filings, and the particular sweetness of rust that has been sitting undisturbed for a very long time. And he found it more interesting than nearly anything else in the world. His mother, Odessa Tarver, said the boy had motor oil where his blood ought to be. His father said nothing. And in Alton Tarver's vocabulary, silence was the highest form of agreement available. Miss. So when the welder died on that Tuesday morning in March, Cordell did not panic, and he did not go looking for a grown man. He carried it into the lean-to, set it on his grandfather's bench, and started taking the case off. He was 14 years old. He had never been inside a welding machine in his life, but he had read every issue of Popular Mechanics the Camden Library carried, and a stack of old service manuals his father had kept in a feed sack. And he had spent enough hours in that shed to understand the one principle Purvis had drilled into him before he was tall enough to see over the bench. If you know how a thing was put together, you can figure out why it came apart. What he found inside took him most of the morning to piece together. A mouse nest, scorched black on one side. A selector switch burned dark at two of its contacts. And a secondary lead where the insulation had cracked and gone to ground against the frame, which was the actual killer, and which was invisible until he pulled the transformer forward and turned it toward the light. He cleaned the contacts with a wire brush and a rag soaked in gasoline. He wrapped the lead, and for the switch, he went to a parts bin on the north wall, a bin his grandfather had labeled by hand in 1974, and he pulled a selector out of a dead buzz box that had been sitting in there since before Cordell was born. It took him 3 hours. Then he clamped the ground to the planter frame, struck an arc, and the machine came alive under his hands with a sound like a hive waking up. There you go. He welded the hitch that afternoon. Then, because the machine was running and the day was not over, he built 11 corral panels out of pipe that had been leaning against the barn since 1981. He did not tell his father what had happened. Alton found out anyway. Fathers do. And his response, delivered at the supper table that evening without ever once looking up from his plate, was 4 words. Good work today, son. That was the beginning. Word travels in a small county on its own schedule, slowly, through the specific channel of men telling other men things at a parts counter on Saturday morning. By the time Cordell was 16, neighbors were bringing him machines. A hay baler with a stripped knotter, a water pump, a generator that had not run since the Carter administration. He fixed most of them. The ones he could not fix, he kept, with permission, which was almost always granted, and granted easily, because a dead machine sitting in a boy's shed is worth considerably more to you than a dead machine sitting in yours. By the spring of 1990, when he walked across the stage at Willcox County High School, Cordell Tarver had a shed of his own behind his parents' house, containing, by rough count, 19 dead welders, 22 electric motors of assorted horsepower, 3 portable generators, and an air compressor with a cracked head. His classmates were talking about college. Cordell was talking about steel. And here is the thing that everybody who retells this story gets wrong, so let me be precise about it while it is still simple. He asked for 2 different things, and he never once confused them. The dead welders and the burned-out motors, those he took for free, and those were tools. The dead machines lying in other men's fence rows and pasture corners, he never took at all. Those he made an offer on. In the summer of 1989, a storm came through the Black Belt, and lightning took the top off a grain bin on the Tarver place. It came down in a heap of galvanized sheet and structural angle in the corner of a soybean field, and it sat there for 2 weeks while Alton figured out what to do about it. 4,000 pounds of steel. The county had a word for that. The word was scrap, and the price was 4 cents a pound. Cordell walked out to it on a Sunday afternoon and stood there a long time, not looking at the wreck, looking at the individual pieces of it, the angle, the channel, the sheet, and thinking about what each one already almost was. Then he got in his father's truck and drove to Tuskegee and spent an entire afternoon in the extension library with a legal pad and a pencil. Here is what he came home with. Scrap steel in Alabama in 1989 moved at 4 cents a pound. That same steel, cut clean, bent to tolerance, welded into a bracket or a hitch or a repair plate that a farmer actually needed on a Tuesday, moved it somewhere between $3 and $14 a pound, depending on how much labor was in it and how bad the man needed it. A commercial fabrication setup capable of doing that work, a track burner, a press brake, a plate roller, ran $8,000 to $14,000 new. Cordell Tarver did not have $8,000. He had a shed full of dead motors and a bin his grandfather labeled in 1974. Steel does not have a price. It has a price to somebody. And the entire distance between 4 cents a pound and $14 a pound is nothing on God's earth but which somebody happens to be standing there looking at it. He did not say a word about any of it to anyone for 3 days. He built the rig that summer. Not from a kit, not from plans, from a yellow legal pad he filled over the course of about 3 weeks, and then from whatever he could put his hands on. The track burner ran on rails he made out of fence posts and salvaged pipe, straight enough that he checked them with a string line twice a day for a month. The press brake was a 20-ton bottle jack pushing against a length of I-beam. With dies he ground himself out of axle stock. The plate roller came off a truck axle, and it was the piece he was proudest of, because it was the piece nobody had told him how to do. Angle iron he bought at the salvage yard down in Pine Hill for 40 cents a pound. Total material cost, not counting the motors he already had, $438. He finished it in September of 1989, a few days after his 17th birthday. And the first thing that came off it was a gooseneck coupler, the ball mount that lets a farm truck pull a stock trailer, built to a drawing he had made by measuring a broken one with a pair of calipers. Alton Tarver set his coffee cup down on the tailgate, walked the length of the shed and picked it up. He turned it in the light. He ran his thumb along the weld, slow, all the way down one side and back up the other, the way a man checks a thing he already suspects is good and does not want to be wrong about. He did not say anything for close to a full minute. "What you fixin' to do with it?" His son said he was going to sell it. "How much?" Cordell said he thought maybe $60. Alton looked at the weld one more time. Then he set the coupler down on the bench, picked his coffee back up and said, And in Alton Tarver's vocabulary, that was a standing ovation. Let me tell you about Wendell Prine, because you cannot understand what happened next without him. Wendell Prine was 53 years old in 1989 and had owned Prine Auto Parts and Machine on the Camden Square for 19 years. He was a big man with a big voice, and the particular confidence of somebody who has been the most knowledgeable person in every room he has walked into for 2 decades running. He knew bearing numbers by heart. He knew which tractors ate clutches and which ones did not. He knew hydraulic fittings, he knew belt sizes, he knew what a rebuilt starter ought to cost, and he knew the credit history of every farming family in Willcox County, including which ones paid at harvest and which ones paid when they could. He held court at that counter every Saturday morning from 7 to 10, dispensing advice that was usually correct and always delivered with the certainty of a man who has never been wrong in a way that cost him anything. He was not a bad man. Understand that, because the story does not work if you make him one. He was a man who had mistaken never being wrong about small things for being incapable of being wrong about big ones, which is a different condition entirely, and a considerably more dangerous one. Wendell Prine had opinions about metal fabrication. Specifically, he had the opinion that a serious fab operation could not be run out of a farm shed in a county like Willcox, and he had arrived at that opinion honestly, through a combination of genuine knowledge, real capital math, and the particular blindness that comes from knowing a thing well enough to stop asking questions about it. One Saturday morning in October of 1989, Cordell Tarver walked into Prine Auto Parts and Machine with a gooseneck coupler tucked under his arm and told Wendell Prine that he had built a fabrication rig and intended to start selling parts. There were 6 men at that counter. Cordell would remember the number for the rest of his life. Wendell looked at the coupler. Then he looked at the boy holding it. And then he laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. That is important. It was the laugh of a man who thinks he is doing somebody a favor by saving them from an expensive embarrassment. The laugh that says, "I already worked this one, son. I already know the answer." He picked the coupler up off the counter, turned it over once, set it back down. A real fab shop costs more than this whole county's got laying around loose. He said it kindly. That was the worst part of it. And the outfits that buy parts want the same part, cut the same, delivered the same day, every month. One boy in a shed can't hold that line. Go on down to A&M, study you some ag business. Come back in 4 years and tell me I was wrong. Somewhere behind him, low, not meant to carry, one of the 6 asked another one of the 6 whose boy that was. And Cordell Tarver heard the second question sitting inside the first one. He did not argue. This is the detail those men would circle back to years later when they were trying to reassemble the story into something that made sense to them. He did not get red in the face. He did not raise his voice. He did not explain the rig, or the legal pad, or the $438. He set the coupler down on the counter, and he set it down deliberately, turned just so that the weld bead caught the fluorescent light overhead and ran clean and even from one end to the other, where every man standing there could see it. Then he said, "Thank you, Mr. Prine." He picked it back up and he walked out. One of the 6 men at that counter told his wife about it that night. He said the strangest part was not the boy, and it was not Wendell. The strangest part was that nobody in the room laughed with him. They just watched a 17-year-old carry a piece of steel back out into the parking lot, and then they went on talking about something else because that is what men do when they are not certain which side of a thing they have just landed on. Cordell drove east that same afternoon and sold it to a trailer shop out on the Camden Highway. $75. The same part, new out of a catalog, cost a farmer better than twice that. Cordell had $9 of steel in it. He turned down a partial scholarship in the spring of 1990 and spent the summer improving the rig instead. He built a blast and cure booth out of the same grain bin the lightning had taken down, cut the shell, stood it back up, ran a burner and a fan through it, and it dropped his finish time from 3 weeks of waiting on paint to 9 days, start to done. That mattered more than anything else he built that year, because a shop that cannot promise a date is not a shop. It is a favor. And in the fall of 1991, his mother drove him to the county courthouse in Camden and made him sit down and fill out the paperwork to register the business, because he was 18 years old and had no earthly idea that paperwork was a thing that existed. Odessa Tarver watched him print the name across the top of the form. Tarver Iron and Repair. "You built it. Your name goes on the paper." She said it without any particular heat, the way you state a rule that is not up for discussion. "Ain't nobody putting theirs on it for you." The first full year was not dramatic. He worked it out in pencil on the back of the same legal pad. Every hour billed, every dollar of rod and gas and steel, and the 30% he paid out to the men whose dead machines he had bought into. What was left over, at 18 years old, was more money than a grown man could make in a year of farm labor in Willcox County. Not double, not triple, just more. Which in that county that year was the whole ball game. The county heard about it by the following spring, and the reaction was not admiration. Not yet. The reaction was the specific brand of skepticism that greets early success in a place where everybody has known everybody since birth. It was a good year. It won't hold. He got lucky on that first contract. Wait till he's got to compete with a real shop. Wendell Prine, when somebody brought the numbers up at the counter, said that he was glad the boy was doing well, and that he hoped he was putting some of it back for when the work slowed down. Which is the kind of thing a man says when he wants to acknowledge a fact without revising his opinion of it. The work did not slow down. In the summer of 1991, Renfro Trailer Works out of Selma put a notice in the Alabama Independent Fabricators newsletter. They were building stock and utility trailers, and they were getting killed by their supplier on 2 parts, axle hangers and heavy hinge assemblies. a few hundred units a month of each on a 2-year term. Their problem was not price. Their problem was that their big supplier could not hold tolerance and hold a delivery date at the same time. And a trailer shop that cannot promise a build date starts losing customers in a hurry. Cordell Tarver got that newsletter because he had joined the association in 1990 for a $12 annual membership that his father had told him was a waste of $12. He called Renfro on a Monday morning. He drove to Selma on Wednesday with 3 sample units wrapped in a feed sack on the seat beside him. The shop foreman who met him in the yard was a heavy-set man named Tolliver, who had been building trailers for 26 years and had seen a great many people walk in with samples. He took the first hanger set out of the sack and turned it over. Then he took it to a bench, clamped it, and put a straight edge across the mounting face. He held it there longer than he needed to. "Who cut this?" Cordell said he had. Tolliver looked up at him, at a 19-year-old in a clean shirt he had obviously borrowed from somebody, and then looked back down at the straight edge. "On what?" Cordell told him. "A track burner running on rails made out of fence posts, and a press brake built around a bottle jack in a shed in Willcox County." Tolliver did not say anything to that at all. He just went and got his boss. Cordell Tarver had a signed contract on Friday. By the end of '91, at 19 years old, he was clearing more in a year than the man who taught him shop class made in 3. And he had not spent one day of his life in a college classroom. Now let me tell you about the winter of 1992, because if I only gave you the good part, I would be lying to you. In January, Renfro sent back 40 hitch assemblies. Porosity in the welds, gas pockets down inside the bead where you cannot see them and cannot feel them and cannot find them without a cross-section or a load that fails at the worst possible moment. 40 units rejected on a 2-year contract that was 11 months old. The cause was not complicated. It was Rod. He had left a box of 732 low hydrogen sitting open on a shelf through 9 straight days of Alabama rain, and the flux had drunk the moisture out of the air the way flux does. And every one of those welds had been laying down hydrogen while he stood there watching it and thinking it looked fine. He did not argue with Renfro. He did not ask for an allowance. He drove to Selma, picked up all 40 units himself, and rebuilt every one of them in 9 days. The steel came out of his own pocket. $1,900 he did not have in January. His father found him at 2 in the morning on the 4th night, sitting on an upturned bucket with a wet stick of rod still in his hand, looking at it. The steel never lied to me. He said it to nobody in particular. Alton did not answer and did not leave. I just wasn't listening. The following week, Cordell welded up a steel box with a 100-watt bulb wired into the bottom of it and a thermometer through the lid, and from that day forward, every stick of rod on the Tarver place lived in it. That box cost him less than $6 to build. And that is the part worth sitting with. $1,900 and 9 days of his life spent learning something that a $6 box would have prevented, and he never once tried to tell it any other way. Renfro renewed the contract in the spring. Then they increased the order. Because a supplier who eats his own mistake in front of you is a rarer thing than a supplier who does not make one. Before the wall, though, a word about what a year actually looked like in that shed. Because the numbers do not tell you, and the numbers are not what a man remembers. A cracked bolster on a bush hog, dropped off Monday, gone Tuesday. A cattle gate bent double where a bull had disagreed with it. Loader arms out of alignment. A grain auger with a torn flighting. Trailer tongues. Bucket teeth. A church van bumper. A hay spear. A well pump housing somebody's grandfather had cast in 1940, and nobody on earth made any more, so Cordell made one. Truck doors opening at 6:40 in the morning. Men standing in the lane with a piece of steel in both hands, and an apology already started, because they knew what they were bringing, and they knew it was ugly. And a boy in his 20s looking at the ugly thing and saying, "Leave it." That is what the middle of this story sounded like. Not contracts, not revenue. 100 small, ruined objects a year, and a shed light burning past dark. Let me tell you about the wall. By 1992, word had carried well past Willcox County, Dallas County to the north, Monroe to the south, men driving an hour with something in the bed of a truck. But the specific thing that found its way to him most reliably, and that would end up mattering more than any of the rest of it, was dead welders, seized machines, cracked cases, burned transformers, selector switches welded to themselves, machines a dealer had looked at once and declared not worth the labor, that had sat in a shed 6 years afterward gathering wasp nests. Machines men were ready to haul to the dump. He asked for them. He asked neighbors. He asked at the feed store. He asked at farm auctions when the miscellaneous lots came up and nobody bid. And he asked at Prime Auto Parts and Machine. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, on the quiet weekdays, when Wendell was not standing at the counter holding court. By the end of 1992, he had 61 of them. By 1994, the number was over 100. People thought it was eccentric. Wendell Prine, when he heard about it in the spring of 1993, said at the counter that the Tarver boy had always been a little different, and that collecting busted welders was at least a harmless way to be different. The men at the counter agreed the way men agree with a thing that seems obviously true and not worth the breath to argue. Wendell Prine believed he was watching a boy collect junk. He was watching a boy build an inventory. There is a difference between those two things, and a man named Purvis Tarver had explained that difference in 1938, standing in a lean-to he had built himself, in almost exactly the same words. Which brings us to 1993, and to the part of this that is genuinely difficult to believe until you have seen the pictures. By that year, the original rig was running flat out, with Renfro pushing for more units and 3 farm accounts waiting behind them. A commercial press and roller of the size he needed ran better than $20,000. Cordell Tarver spent $1,400. For power, he pulled 18 motors and transformers off the wall, machines the county had collectively agreed were garbage, and ganged them onto a common shaft cut from salvaged truck axle. For pressure, he rebuilt a hydraulic pack out of a combine pump that had come to him in a 5-gallon bucket, in pieces, as a favor. What came out the other end was a 40-ton press brake and a 12-foot plate roller. The first time he brought the whole thing up under load, the shed filled with a sound like a sustained mechanical argument, and the lights in the farmhouse 200 feet away dimmed and came back. The first real job through it was a 1951 Massey Harris 44 that had been rotting in a fence row on the Ferris place for 9 years, because moving it required equipment nobody nearby had. Cordell rolled new sheet for the fenders. He pressed a new bolster plate. He rebuilt the front end out of 3 donor machines off his own wall. Alton Tarver, who by that point had watched a great many decent things come out of his son's shed and had stopped being surprised by most of them, stood in the doorway when that tractor fired for the first time in 9 years and said that he had not seen anything like it in his life. It sold to a collector in Birmingham, and the man drove down himself to load it. He asked Cordell what shop had done the restoration so he could send other work that way. Cordell told him he was standing in it. That fall, a 19-year-old named Wade Kittrell started coming out on weekends to sweep the shop and grind welds, which is how most people start. By 1995, Tarver Iron and Repair was pulling machines and metalwork off 11 farm properties across the county and running 2 part-time hands, both local men who had learned the shop from the floor up, the same way Cordell had, by doing it and getting it wrong first. He was 22 years old. He owned every piece of equipment in that shed outright. He carried no debt of any kind. And he had started paying his parents a lease rate on the ground the shop sat on that was, by Alton's own private accounting, more than that ground had ever produced in beans. But the number that mattered in 1995 was not on any invoice. It was 147. That was how many dead machines had found their way to the Tarver place by that spring. 63 of them he had brought back and put to work. 41 more he had cut up for parts to finish those rebuilds. The rest sat in pieces along the north wall, cataloged, waiting their turn. He had not paid 1 cent for a single one of them. When let me tell you about the afternoon Wendell Prine drove out there, because it is the scene that every person in Willcox County who knows this story remembers most clearly, including the ones who were not present and are working entirely from what they were told. He did not call ahead. It was a Wednesday in April of 1995, when the mud in a farm lane has just started to firm up after the spring rain. He parked by the barn and walked to the shed and stood in the open doorway. The rig was running. It made that same sound, that long mechanical argument, and Cordell, feeding plate through the roller with his back to the door, did not hear him come in. Wade Kittrell saw him and said nothing and kept grinding. When the pass finished and the shop went quiet, Wendell said the boy's name. Cordell turned around. He was 22 years old, with grinding dust in his hair and oil to the elbows, and the particular stillness of a man who has been doing exactly what he intended to do for 6 years, and has arrived somewhere the work speaks well enough that he does not have to. Wendell Prine looked past him, at the 2 rigs, at the ganged motors on their frames, at the cure booth glowing through the open bay door, at the wall, the whole north wall, of dead and half-dead and running machines, cataloged and hung in rows with the exact organizing logic Purvis Tarver had applied to a lean-to in 1938. He was quiet for longer than was comfortable for anybody standing in that building. "I told you this couldn't be done." He said it with his eyes still moving across the shop, like a man reading a bill he does not intend to pay. Cordell wiped his hands on a rag. He took his time with it. "You told me the capital was out of reach. $6,200. That's the whole shop, door frame to door frame." Wendell Prine opened his mouth to say the second thing. It was the volume argument. He had made it 100 times at that counter, and it was a good argument, and he got about 4 words into it before he stopped. Because the roller was standing 8 feet behind the boy with a finished stack beside it, and there was a Renfro delivery tag wired to the top plate, and Wendell Prine had spent 19 years being able to read a shop floor. He did not finish the sentence. He looked at the stack for a while instead. "And I told you to go on and study business." Cordell set his gloves down on the bench. "I've been in class since I was 14. Y'all just couldn't see the building." Wendell Prine stood in that doorway a long moment, and when his voice came back, it had lost most of the thing that had made it the authoritative voice at that counter for 20 years. He said there was a man he knew, he was not going to say who, with 63 pieces of dead equipment scattered across 40 acres, accumulated since 1952, and no idea on earth what to do with any of it. He said he had told that man there was nobody in this county who could handle a job that size without a real machine shop behind him. And he said he'd heard about you. So I figured, before I go wasting his time, I'd come look for myself. Cordell Tarver looked at him for a moment. "Send him out." Then he turned back to the roller and fed the next plate through. Wendell stood there a few seconds more. Then he walked to his truck and drove down the lane and turned onto the county road and was gone. He never apologized. Some men don't. That is just the truth of it. But he drove out. And in Willcox County, Alabama, a man standing in your shed looking at what you built is about the closest thing to an apology you are ever going to be handed. Let me tell you about Hollis Pruitt. He came out the following week. 71 years old, 40 acres of scattered equipment his father had started accumulating in 1952. Tractors, combines, hay equipment, a road grader, 3 trucks, sitting in the weeds where each one had finally quit. A buyer out of Montgomery had already been. He had walked it with a clipboard and offered $4,200 for the entire lot. $67 a machine, which was fair by the only measure that buyer used. He was going to load all 63 onto flatbeds and put them on a scale. Cordell walked that property for 2 hours on a Thursday morning. He did not take notes at first. He just looked at machines. at what was seized and what was only stuck, at what was rusted through and what was rusted over, at which ones had been parked because they broke, and which ones had been parked because somebody bought a newer one. Then he sat down on a cultivator frame at the edge of the field and did arithmetic on a yellow legal pad for about 20 minutes. The number he came up with was $197,820. "That ain't possible." Hollis Pruitt said it without looking up from the pad. "It is, if you sell the machine instead of the metal." Then Cordell explained it, the way his grandfather would have explained something, directly, without 1 ounce of condescension, as if the information had simply been sitting there available and he happened to be the one handing it over. 19 of these will run again. He said it flat like inventory and let the man look down the row before he went on. The other 44 never will, but they ain't worthless. They're parts. Hollis Pruitt did not say anything. Cordell tapped the pad twice with 2 fingers. That buyer was fixin' to put all 63 on the same scale. Hollis Pruitt did not answer him right away. He stood up off the fender he had been leaning on and walked about 30 feet out into the weeds to a hay rake that had been sitting there since the Nixon administration, and he put his hand on it. His father had bought that rake. He said so, to nobody, half turned away. Then he came back and asked one question, and it was not about the money. "You gonna cut 'em up in front of me?" Cordell told him no. He told him every machine that could run again was going to run again, and that the ones that could not were going to end up holding somebody else's gate shut for the next 40 years, and that either way, not one piece of that field was going to a scale. Hollis Pruitt signed that afternoon. The terms were the same ones Cordell used with everybody. 30% of net to the owner, all labor and marketing carried by the shop, a full written accounting every quarter. The Pruitt job took 14 months because Cordell would not rush it. Every machine got evaluated by itself before anybody touched it with a torch. The final accounting went to Hollis Pruitt in June of 1996. It came in a little under what Cordell had written on that legal pad, and Cordell said so out loud before Hollis had finished opening the envelope. Hollis Pruitt's share came to $56,220. He had been offered $4,200 for the same equipment 14 months earlier. He told everybody he knew, and in Willcox County, Alabama, everybody he knew meant everybody. On a Saturday morning in September of 1996, Cordell Tarver walked into Prine Auto Parts and Machine at 7:30 in the morning. It was the first time he had been inside that building during the Saturday gathering since he was 17 years old, and had set a gooseneck coupler down on the counter and been told kindly that it would never work. He was 23. He was wearing exactly what he always wore: canvas pants, a jacket with a tear in the left elbow, boots with about 4 years of daily use on them. He had grinding dust in his hair. He was carrying a yellow legal pad. There were 9 men at that counter, and one of them was Wendell Prine. The conversation stopped when he came through the door, which is the thing that happens in a small place when somebody walks into a room and the room already knows the story of what they have been doing. "Morning," several men said it back. Wendell Prine said it and then went quiet. Cordell set the legal pad down on the counter, turned so it faced them, and stepped back. On the top sheet was a single table, 12 farm properties in Willcox County, listed by family name, and every man at that counter knew every one of those names, and 2 of them were looking at their own. 2 columns: what a commercial buyer had offered that family for its dead equipment, and what that family had actually been paid. The bottom of the page had one figure on it, underlined twice: $522,600. That was the difference. That was what had stayed in Willcox County instead of riding a flatbed to Montgomery. He did not say one word about it. He let 9 men do their own reading. Then, without looking up, "And that's not counting the Pruitt place. I've got room for 4 more properties this year. I'm at the shop Thursday afternoons." He picked the pad up off the counter, said goodbye to the room, and walked out. The silence held for about 10 seconds. Then Wendell Prine said, to nobody in particular, I should have drove out there in '89. All 4 slots were filled by the end of the week. That was the end of the argument. What follows is only what a man does with the next 30 years, once nobody is arguing with him anymore. Between 1996 and 2006, Tarver Iron and Repair grew to 31 properties across 3 counties and 4 full-time hands. He built a 3rd rig in 2001 and powered it with a salvaged industrial motor out of a plant liquidation in Pine Hill, a $4,800 motor he bought for $200 because nobody else at that auction had a use for it. By 2003, the wall held over 200 machines, and the running inventory Cordell kept on a clipboard. Model, year, condition, parts pulled, parts available, was 37 pages long. Wade Kittrell, who by then had been there 10 years, told people the wall was a library. Except every book on it, he'd say, is also an engine. In 2004, a buyer named Roy Denton called from a national distributor and asked for a meeting, and Cordell drove up to Selma to take it. Denton wanted 1,200 units a month, at a price better than anything Cordell had ever been offered. More than double everything the shop was doing. He listened all the way through and did not argue a word of it. When Denton finished, Cordell answered once, and then stopped talking. At 1,200 a month, I'm selling pounds again. And soon as I'm selling pounds, I'm up against men with capital I don't have and don't want. Roy Denton looked at him a while. That's a hell of a position for a man running rebuilt welders in a farm shed. My granddaddy built the shed. He said it as information, without any pride attached to it at all, and then he drove home. Wendell Prine retired in 2002. Cordell came to the gathering they held for him at the counter on a Saturday morning, which was the only appropriate time. He did not make a speech. He shook the man's hand and said he had learned a great deal from a conversation they had in 1989. Wendell looked at him. You learned it in spite of me, not because of me. You told me what I'd have to prove. They shook hands again, and that was the end of it. Let me tell you about Alton Tarver, because I have not given him enough of this story and he has earned more. He farmed those 160 acres until his knees made it impractical, and then he spent the last years of it doing what he had always done in the lean-to, taking things apart, working out why they failed, putting them back together, mostly for neighbors, mostly for nothing. He died in March of 2008, at 79, in the farmhouse where he had been born. The obituary in the Camden paper ran 4 paragraphs. It did not mention the shop. It did not mention the wall. It did not mention $522,000 that stayed in Willcox County because his son had paid attention to what he was taught. Alton Tarver would not have considered any of that worth putting in an obituary. He would have said that a man does his work, and the work speaks or it doesn't. And either way, the man is gone and the work is still standing there. The lean-to Purvis Tarver built in 1938 is still standing. Cordell maintains it the way Purvis maintained it and Alton maintained it, not as a museum, but as a working building. Because a shed that isn't used is just a structure, and a structure that isn't used falls down. The bench where a 14-year-old boy took the case off a welding machine in March of 1987 is still in there. And so is the parts bin on the north wall, still labeled in Purvis Tarver's handwriting from 1974, supplemented now, in a second hand, by his grandsons. In the spring of 2013, Cordell Tarver's daughter walked into the shop with a notebook under her arm. Simone Tarver was 16 years old, which was exactly the age her father had been the summer he first started thinking seriously about what 4 cents a pound was actually worth. She told him she had been reading about airflow and cure cycles. She said the booth was moving air wrong for the volume it held, and that if the intake and the baffling were reconfigured, the 9-day finish cycle could come down to 3 days for most of what came through it. She said that would put roughly 30% more work out the door without buying a single piece of equipment. She said she had run the numbers, and that they were in the notebook. Cordell Tarver looked at his daughter. Then he looked at the notebook. And he thought about a yellow legal pad, and an afternoon in a library in Tuskegee, and a gooseneck coupler on a counter, and a man who had laughed. "Show me the numbers." She handed him the notebook. He read it standing up all the way through, and then he went back and read part of it again. "We'll build the test booth this summer." "Really?" "You did the work." He handed the notebook back. "We do the work, that's how it goes. Cody Prine told me last week these booths ain't worth fooling with." Cordell wiped his hands and did not look up. "Good. Now you know exactly what you've got to prove." Simone Tarver built the test booth that summer. The reconfigured airflow brought the cure cycle down to 3 days. Throughput went up 34%, slightly better than she had projected. She wrote the results in the notebook, and the notebook went on a shelf in the equipment shed. It sits there now next to 3 other pieces of paper. A parts bin label in Purvis Tarver's hand from 1974, a yellow legal pad from 1989, and a business registration form filled out at the Willcox County Courthouse in 1991 because a woman named Odessa made her son write his own name across the top of it. 4 pieces of paper, 1 shelf, 3 generations. Tarver Iron and Repair is still running. The experts still say the model doesn't work in a county like that one. Not enough capital, not enough volume, not enough of anything. The Tarvers have been proving them wrong for better than 25 years, 1 weld at a time, on machines everybody else had already declared dead. He asked for your broken machines. They laughed. He built the shop ran, the work paid, and the money stayed home. Somewhere in your own family there is a person like this. A grandfather, an aunt, a neighbor, somebody who kept the thing everybody else had already written off and then made it run. Tell me about them down in the comments. I read them. And if you want more stories about ordinary people in small places who quietly outworked everybody who doubted them, subscribe, and I'll have another one for you. Thanks for staying to the end.